And it's my honor and pleasure, as always, to introduce to you Lyndon LaRouche.
Thank you, Dennis. And thank you, Mr. President. What I shall do is to give you the situation in which this problem of Africa today is situated. The situation both as it bears upon our condition. This is not something in some other country with which we may or may not be concerned as our moral inclinations guide us. This is something which affects us directly. If Africa dies, most of us will die. I'll indicate that to you somewhat. But also there's a second question, is what do we do about it? How do we change it? Not simply how do we condemn it, but how do we change it? How to reverse it? Perhaps how do we go forward in order to provide for the people of Africa who are now being victimized what they have long deserved and have not yet received? The opportunity to develop their own nations and to participate in those things which the rest of us, at least used to, consider our right. Now, look around you and get a glimpse of reality. This is not a story on a television screen. This is not a story in a book or a play on a stage. This is reality. This is not about Africans. This is about you. You're in the same play. You're in the same world. And the things that are hurting the Africans are already hurting most of you, whether you're in the United States or some other country. What threatens Africans is threatening you, whether you're in Africa, the United States, or any other part of this planet. It affects people in Iran. It affects people in China who may not, in the hinterlands of China, where the development now in progress is not yet fully reached. It affects their destiny. It affects the people in North Korea who are subjected to a famine being fostered by the friends of George Bush in the Koreas and in that part of the world generally. We are all affected. We're in the same drama. The same evil that is killing Africans is killing us, or will kill us soon. The same evil is responsible for blown out credit cards in the United States, for the increase of the death rate, for the person that has turned away from the hospital that no longer exists to die, for the person who is left on the streets to die because they didn't have the right cards to be admitted for treatment, for the people who are suffering from diseases because of the deterioration of the environment, or suffering from diseases, epidemic diseases, which we once brought under control. The people who are hungry, the people who are afraid of certain parts of the city where people are killing in a kind of new age orgy of drugs and death. Little children, teenage children are considered the most dangerous criminals in this country. It's part of the same problem. We are in a decaying civilization and have been in a decaying civilization for the past 30-odd years. Gradually, as our society has been decaying, as our morals have been decaying, as our commitment and institutions have been decaying, as the economy which affects us all has been decaying, things become worse and worse and worse. Now, for the ordinary human being who doesn't always think too carefully, who thinks too selfishly, who thinks too narrowly, who thinks too much in terms of locality and in terms of the passing moment of central experience in personal life, 30 years is a long time. In the course of history, 30 years is not a long time. It's like a moment. And the evil that we did to ourselves 30 years ago, or that we tolerated to be done to ourselves, has caught up with us 30 years later. It has been 30 years downhill. If you could take, remember you've probably seen sometime these so-called lapse time photography. You take a camera and you take it out in the garden or you take it in a hothouse, and you aim it at a plant, and you click a frame every few minutes or so forth. Now you take that film, which is clicked a frame every few minutes, and you speed it up to, say, 16 or 32 or whatever frames per second. And now you see the weed that was growing moving and writhing. You see the flower exploding. Yeah? And you say, oh, if you just get the right time scale, how different plant life looks. Or you can do the same thing with a bacteriological culture done under microscopic procedure, the same thing. Now look at this past 30 years with the eye of lapse time photography. Look at the changes in our society, all over the world, in terms of lapse time photography. Think of how things were different and mostly better in the United States 30 years ago. Think of neighborhoods, say in Washington, D.C., which 30 years ago may have been somewhat poor, but were habitable, which were secure, where families lived and raised children. Think of Howard University. Think of the hospitals that were here that are no longer here. Think of the killing in the streets now, which was not there 30 years ago. Now think over 30 years. Think of the process of change, of deterioration of life around us. And 30 years is not such a long time. It's a moment. So don't think, well, what we did 30 years ago, that's not important. Let's talk about more recent events. But more recent events were shaped by decisions we made 30 years ago. The child is the parent to the adult. From the child comes the adult. From the decision comes a process of growth, a process of change. And to understand how the change came about, you've got to go back to when the change started. We changed our values, we changed our ideas. 30 years ago, we were a very bad and shocked nation here. We had just gone through two great shocks, and some other shocks as well. The first shock was 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you had people going to church who didn't know what one was and crowding in. That was a short period of time, but they did it. You had even Washington bureaucrats going to church. And everyone knows they're heathen. Then you had, 13 months later, you had the assassination of a president of the United States who had been a hero. And nobody did anything about it. They did what the old Southern sheriff used to do when a woman was reported to be raped. Even before he found out if the woman was raped, he'd go out and find some poor boy out there, grab him and hang him. And they took this Lee Harvey Oswald, who was actually a government agent, who had actually sent a telegram to J. Edgar Hoover warning against the threat of an assassination in Dallas-Fort Worth. And they took him out and they hung him. They shot him. And then they tried him after he was shot with no evidence. They had a commission to invest. They didn't allow a trial to occur, which should have occurred in Texas. They set up a special commission among people who included those who would help to arrange the killing of the president. They called it the Warren Commission. And everybody knew it stunk. And these two shocks, the fact that the missile crisis, where everybody thought they were going to be vaporized by nuclear weapons coming in on missiles the following day. And they faced that reality in a period of a week or 2 weeks here. And the second thing, a president was shot. Then you had the shocks after that. You had the shooting of Malcolm X. Then you had the shooting of Martin Luther King, which was almost the end of our morality. And nobody cared about that. We all knew who was targeting Martin Luther King. It wasn't some poor guy who didn't even know what rifle to buy, who struck a plea bargain to keep from being executed. We knew it was J. Edgar Hoover. We all knew it. Everybody in the movement knew it. Everybody who was watching knew that J. Edgar Hoover was involved in the killing of Martin Luther King. He was his avowed enemy. Now, what did that do to the America people who had gone through the shock of the missile crisis, who had then gone through the shock of a president being killed, or a lot of young people in this country who are baby boomers, that we call them today, who had been involved in the idea of truth, and to them the civil rights marches and the civil rights movement as expressed by Martin Luther King's leadership was that truth. And Martin wasn't just a civil rights leader. He was something special. Martin was a man of Gethsemane. He was a man who could say, as he said before he died, he's a man who could walk to the mountain or into the Garden of Gethsemane and be presented a cup and say, if it is thy will, I will drink of this cup. And he did. He said it. This is not an ordinary man. And to lose such a man is a great shock. And all the people in this country who were at that point sensitive and moral and cared, they were driven into deep cultural pessimism by these events. And when you take a people like ourselves, some of us are tougher. I'm tougher in some ways. But most people aren't tough. I know that. I've lived in this society and had to gauge myself against my fellow Americans and others. And most of them are very weak compared to my standard. And I say, well, you've got to save these people despite the fact they're weak. So if I'm tougher, I'll just have to make up for their weakness and try to give them some courage. But when people are hit like that, you get an effect which was sometimes called in World War I shell shock. In World War II, we had another name for it. We called it combat fatigue. I don't know what they're calling it now. They're calling it the midlife crisis, I guess. But in any case, when people are in those kind of events, or people witness or participate in a mass disaster like that bombing that occurred in the Oklahoma Federal Building, some catastrophe which hits them immediately, a great storm, a great calamity, people who are not adequately prepared in character and other ways to deal with these things become like frightened sheep. They become highly suggestible. Now, how did they do that to us? These events were used to play upon the broken spirits, the fear of people in the United States and also in other countries. And they introduced a great change in the standards of morality which had prevailed up to that time. After the shooting of the missile crisis and the following shooting of Kennedy, and then finally culminating with the killing of Martin Luther King, this country was no longer, and this people of this country were no longer the people they had been at the beginning of the 1960s when John F. Kennedy was elected. They had changed. They had become demoralized. Those of us who study history know these things because we have seen things. For example, after the terrible period following the French Revolution, which was actually organized from London, France went through a great agony, which culminated in the rise of an evil man called Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte plunged all Europe, together with his adversaries, into a series of bloody wars. The population of France was almost depleted as the young men of France were dragged off to fight these wars and the great losses from Napoleon's wars. Then, at the end of this period, the most reactionary and evil forces in Europe set up a tyranny, a dictatorship, which is called the Congress of Vienna, sometimes called by those who knew it the Sexual Congress of Vienna, because the Congress was not arranged by the monarchs and others and the other aristocrats who attended it, because they weren't at the conference sessions. The greatest pimp in modern history, Clement Prince Metternich, used his secret police to provide female entertainment, countesses and peasant maidens, to keep Tsar Alexander I and similar potentates amused and entertained. while a few bureaucrats in the back room worked out the agreements under Metternich direction and the direction of some others, which were imposed on Europe by the Congress of Vienna. All Europe was plunged into a great period of cultural pessimism under an evil feudal reaction, jointly run by the Holy Alliance and the British Empire. And in that period, the people who had been good people, in large part in the prior period, became culturally pessimistic and turned into evil people, people who did evil things. And we are still to this day paying the price in European civilization for the effects on the minds of human beings, European population generally, of that evil reactionary abomination, the Sexual Congress of Vienna. Then we had the experience of this century of World War I, a war which had never been fought, in which the wrong people won. The British started it, and they won it. Then at the end of the war, all principles of Christian morality were abandoned at a Versailles Treaty. No peace can ever be based on vengeance. You pay a price for it. Evil was imposed upon the world. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson, the man who had organized the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in this country from the White House, a great Democrat, plunged the country into a depression by shutting down the economy at the end of the war. I was born during that period. And during the 1920s, the American people went crazy under the influence of Wilson and Coolidge. Don't blame Hoover, it's Wilson and Coolidge. Two very evil people who happened to be, among some other evil people, presidents of the United States at one time or another. The Idi Amins of the United States. We were plunged into cultural pessimism. I can recall as a young person the moral degeneracy which had gripped my parents' generation during the 1920s. Then you could look across the water at a later time, back in the 1930s when I became interested in these things. And a great cultural pessimism and moral degeneracy had swept over Europe as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Immorality, deep pessimism, typified by a Nazi by the name of Martin Heidegger, a professor of existentialism and the spiritual father of his follower, Jean-Paul Sartre of France, otherwise the inventor of Sartre masochism, which he gave us Frantz Fanon, among other things. Pessimism. Out of that, we got Nazism. We got fascism in Germany. We got the conditions which led into a Second World War. When we came back from the Second World War, serving overseas, we had come back filled with optimism from the fact that under Roosevelt's leadership, we had rebuilt this broken economy, not only as a war economy, but rebuilt as an economy, as Lincoln had built the United States into the world's greatest economic power at the end of his presidency, continuing into the next century. The great industrial revolution of the 19th century began here in the United States. In the middle of the last century, the United States was economically the most advanced, most powerful, militarily, economically, and in technology in the world. It was American technology which, blended with German science, created the industrial revolution in Germany in the last quarter of the last century. We were demoralized too. The history of this country is full of the demoralization. Is when the other side, the spawn of the Confederacy, such as Grover Cleveland, Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson, all great admirers of the Confederacy, took over and plunged us into Great Depression. During the same thing that happened as a result of the 1960s. And when you look at history, as I've just described a few highlights, it's easier to understand. You go into the philosophy departments of our universities and junior colleges or so-called community colleges today, and in what passes for philosophy departments do they teach? They teach the doctrine of the father of Nazism, Friedrich Nietzsche. They teach the philosophy of a similar existentialist, the Nazi professor Martin Heidegger. They teach the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre and Frantz Fanon, who is a student of Sartre, all of whom are Nazis. The common characteristic of the list of the retinue that the President described are from Dar es Salaam University. What they were educated in that made them Nazi-like butchers, and they are Nazi-like butchers. If you read their speeches and statements, you'll recognize that. They were trained in Nazism at Dar es Salaam University under Julius Nyerere, then the president of Tanzania, who was the British intelligence controller for that region of Africa at that time, who controlled every government except his, and they got rid of him, in Uganda in that period. They controlled the succession of power. The guy that brought Museveni to power in Uganda, all trained together with the present dictator of Eritrea, the present dictator of Ethiopia, the present dictator of Rwanda, the present dictator of the so-called resistance movement in invading Sudan, John Garang, the criminal who turned politician, Laurent Kabila, one of the worst criminals ever to appear on the face of this earth, and I mean just straight criminal, who is now the so-called president-designate of Congo. The same Frantz Fanon, that's what they were indoctrinated in. Frantz Fanon wrote the Mein Kampf of Africa, in which many people in this country also were educated as a liberation philosophy. We have in this country, in our universities, we are saturated with admiration among our young people with the teaching of people who are part of the same tradition and express the same philosophy as the Nazis. The Nazi philosophy, which is typified by the teachings of the Nazi professor Martin Heidegger. You have people who are otherwise influenced by Adorno, Theodor Adorno. Theodor Adorno of the Frankfurt School. Hannah Arendt, who's Adorno's friend and also Martin Heidegger's friend. Hannah Arendt once used to sleep with Martin Heidegger and admired him to the end of his life, despite the fact that she was Jewish and he was a Nazi. This depravity, this spiritual depravity, is hegemonic in the philosophy departments of our universities and community colleges today, which typifies the fact that since the mid-60s, European civilization, notably the civilization of the United States, has been corrupt, decaying, degenerate, as has happened in earlier periods of history. As a result of that degeneracy, what we would not have tolerated while Kennedy was alive, a great genocide now ongoing in Africa, which is more serious, more pervasive, and more cruel than the genocide which the Nazis perpetrated under wartime conditions in Eastern Europe against Jews, Gypsies, and others, is now ongoing. The American population so far has been generally indifferent to the fact of this genocide. The leadership of the foundation-approved African American movements, including the black congressional Caucasians, generally are supporting the butchers who are killing the Africans. Americans don't care, even though leading news media, including of all places that pestilence, the Washington pestilence here in Washington, on the front pages, have described in some detail and with some degree of accuracy the nature of the crimes going on. No one cares. People are talking about human rights in China. We have in the United States, we have the same percentile of the population in prison as they do in China. Shall we make sanctions against the United States? We have slave prison labor privatized in the United States in the prison systems of the state and federal system. Shall we pull sanctions on the United States? We have corporations, and we have a former president and his friends in the United States who are heavily invested and profiting from genocide in Africa, as George Bush in the case of the Barrack Gold operation and other operations. We have people in the United States, including some people in government institutions, who, contrary to government policy, that is, presidential policy, executive department policy, are collaborating in allowing Israeli gun runners to take US-made weapons stored in Uganda and ship them into forces which are invading Congo-Brazzaville at this time. We condone this. We have two members of the Congress, Chris Smith from Trenton, New Jersey, and Frank Wolf from Northern Virginia, who are members of a British intelligence organization called Christian Solidarity International, which is fronting for the genocide in Africa. How are such things possible? How is this hypocrisy possible? Because we have become, as a people, morally degenerated, morally decadent, even relative to what I thought was the very poor quality of our morality 30 years ago and longer. So therefore, when you say something is happening in Africa, genocide in Africa, we are not simply talking about something on the African stage. We're not simply saying have empathy for the suffering people of some foreign country as if they were some foreign planet. What we're seeing is the symptom in Africa of the moral self-destruction of the entire civilization. So therefore, you cannot cure the problems of Africa by simply addressing the problems of Africa, though they must be addressed. Because to address something means that you intend to succeed, not simply make a token protest. How do we succeed in reversing what is going on in Africa? Not how do we protest. How do we stop it and reverse it? Well, some people say God is powerful and wise. A civilization in past, again, another thing from history, civilizations and cultures which continue to do what we are doing to ourselves as our civilization and culture. These civilizations have been overthrown like the great empires in the dust of Mesopotamia, which fell one after the other, like Sodom and Gomorrah, which are gone. We have a few relics of that, but it's gone. In the philosophy departments of our universities, I believe. Nations and empires which were evil are gone. They were destroyed. And this civilization, if it doesn't fix itself, will also be destroyed. We are in the process of destroying ourselves. And what does that mean? We used to be a nation which is committed to scientific and technological progress. We used to be a nation that was committed to universal education, and we fought to improve the quality of education and to extend that improved quality to everyone. No longer. In the middle of the 1960s, under the influence of a cultural shock, we went from a nation committed to scientific and technological progress to a post-industrial utopia. We threw our morals in the ash can in order to jump into a bordello called the rock, drug, sex counterculture. Our entertainment is no longer moral. It isn't even fit to watch. And people take a lot of it. We drug our minds. More people are doing it. We kill each other. More people are doing it. Government has become totally immoral. The justice system is no longer a justice system. It's like a hunt. It's like a game hunt, wild game hunt. And the guy who comes back with the biggest trophies, the most money, the most scalps in the prosecution system prevails. What's happening to us? As a result of these changes in economy, in morality, and so forth, the entire system, as it's now structured and has been structured over the past 30 years, is finished. I can't tell you the day it will go under, but the entire world system is now finished. We had statements recently of two types, which you should look at. to understand how the Africa problem is situated. First of all, there is no leading circle in governments around the world which does not know the present international financial and monetary system is finished. There is no banking system of any country, possibly excepting China, and that for political reasons, which is not bankrupt. All the leading banks of the United States as a system are presently bankrupt. They're dead. It's just a question of when they fall over. We have been through a crisis this year for about 1 month's duration, from mid-March to mid-April. A shock, a financial shock. We are now headed toward a far more serious one, which may not be the last shock before the system goes under. But the leading leaders of governments and other institutions, such as the Bank for International Settlements, in a recent report, the discussions in the back room preparatory for the G7, G8 meeting, which the heads of state will be attending, are discussing this problem, that the international financial system and its banking system presently are bankrupt worldwide. Not one country, not some other country. They're all bankrupt. And the crisis which is upcoming, triggered by an international real estate bubble crisis, tells everyone that sooner or later, and probably sooner, the big one is coming, when the whole system goes under. What they will be discussing as they walk into the G7 meeting, where the president will be as a speaker, they will be discussing how to try to hold the system together a little bit longer before it blows. In Europe, there was an agreement imposed upon Germany as a condition of unification, imposed by George Bush and company some years ago, 1991, called the Maastricht Agreement, which is an agreement to dissolve the sovereignties of the present nation-states of Europe and to set up a common European currency and a common unrepresented, unelected government as a dictatorship of overall Europe, called the Maastricht Treaty. Up until a short time ago, everyone was convinced this was going through. Then came rumblings, mass strikes, eruptions over unemployment, protests against austerity. Every time the Germans cut the budget, the national budget, in order to meet Maastricht conditions, the fall in the tax revenue base was greater than the amount of budgetary cuts. So every time we cut the budget, the budgetary problem got worse. It happens also in the United States, not as severely. It's collapsing. Now that is doomed. The Maastricht Agreement, while there's a temporary agreement on that effect, continue that, is doomed. It's finished. It's not going to happen. In the midst of this, several other things are happening, which include the statement on Africa by the president recently, which include promises for job-creating programs and things of that sort. These are occurring in Europe. They're occurring in France. In particular, they occurred at the Amsterdam Summit. They're being discussed at institutions in Germany. They're being discussed here. People will be cynical and say, yes, these are fine-sounding programs, but there's no money behind them. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. These are very serious discussions, because everybody in a leading position who has any sense at all in and around governments, whether in the United States government or any other government, knows this banking and financial system is finished. No one can save it. The question is, what do you do? And the image that comes to mind in the United States is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who took us out of a Great Depression, out of a Wilson Coolidge Depression, and under the guise of a war economy, made this nation again the most powerful nation on the planet. And all of us who went through that experience, and those who heard about the experience, said there was a time in the midst of a great crisis when a great president once again reached out to uplift and mobilize the nation to rebuild the nation and to revive it. We need a president to do that, they tend to say. And you've got Bill Clinton. Well, you say, well, Bill Clinton's president. This is going to come on his watch. you're going to have to make Bill Clinton the president who can do what has to be done. It's what you do if you're a citizen. If the president lacks some abilities, you find ways of giving him the abilities he needs and the encouragement, which may take various forms, including harsh ones, to get him to do the job. So what's happening is it's not a hopeless situation. It's a division of the waters. It's a fork in the road. You cannot go backwards. The bridge you just came across is collapsing. There's no way back. You have to go forward. And like Hamlet in Shakespeare's play, you have to decide, as he's discussed and failed in his great soliloquy, to be or not to be. There's one road, which is the old way of doing things, which leads to certain doom for himself and his nation. There's another way, another road, with which he's unfamiliar, which leads away from doom, but he's not familiar with the road. And because of his cowardice, his intellectual cowardice, he refuses to take the new road, and that said takes the road which he knows will lead, and does in the play, to his self-destruction and the destruction of his nation. We have come to that kind of point. Yes, there is a future. The past is dead. That road you cannot walk anymore. Those institutions, those banks, they don't exist anymore, not in that form. But how does the human race go on? What happens to the passengers on the sinking Titanic? First, they must get off the Titanic. But where do they go? What direction do they take? So then the great question now is not what is the past is dead, except for those who refuse to face reality. The old system is dead. The question is, which road to the future? Do we repeat the same mistakes? Do we try to say, let's have Maastricht, let's have austerity, let's have IMF conditionalities, let's have Newt Gingrich, let's have Phil Gramm? He's a big hole, but don't try to fill him up. Too big. Or do we take a different road? Do we build, and what people are discussing when they talk about job creating projects, they talk about justice for African Americans, they talk about improved education, all these kinds of things that are being discussed around the world now. These are very serious but frightened people who are heads of leaders of governments who are saying, let us put on the table some proposals for different policies, proposals which, if they are given support, if they are become the policy of the world, will get us out of this mess. So when people come up with a proposal which will work, but you say they're not serious, there's no money, why is there no money? Because the people are not yet scared enough of what's happening to them to make the decision to support these programs. But what do you do? Before you do something, don't you talk about it? Before you get married, unless you're working for the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, don't you meet and discuss with a prospective marriage partner before you enter this agreement? So isn't the first thing to do in a time of crisis to try to prepare society by selecting those kinds of ideas which we agree will provide the alternative to the way things are going? In other words, the first step is to educate ourselves, to get involved in discussing and organizing around alternative policies which become the thing to which we can get people to turn when the crisis really hits enough to convince them they can't cling to the Titanic. You know, it's tough to get people off an ocean liner in a choppy sea, even when people know it's sinking. I don't want to go in a lifeboat, but this ship is going to sink. Oh, I don't want to believe that. Don't tell me that. I don't want to hear that. And some people even try to get a better seat at the master dining table, or improve their cabin when somebody leaves it, or something like that. The ship is sinking. And that's what you have. You know, people in this country, the average person will say, you tell them that the banking system, the financial system is crashing. No, that is not happening. I can't believe that. Why can't you believe that? They, some mysterious powers up there, would never let that happen to my money. People are clinging to the delusion of something they're going to lose. And they're unwilling to accept the reality that we, as a soldier in war, sometimes has to face, the reality that we must choose a new road. So what must we do? We must use the precious little time available to us to organize around alternatives which we may not yet have the political support to implement, but which will work. And when there's obviously no other alternative, masses of people will rally around these things. But if they don't know about these ideas, we don't organize around these ideas, then when the time of crisis comes, they'll just go crazy because they don't have a clear conception of an alternative. That is the world situation today. An immoral civilization is going to its doom, a self-imposed doom. We're well rid of it because it would kill us sooner or later anyway. The question is, have we the courage to adopt an alternative, and do we know what the alternative is? These are the important things to watch around things like the G7 summit and discussion of it now. Now, where does Africa stand in this? Well, you're coming to a point where you're coming to a completely new geometry. The old geometry of the old system is out. We're now going to a non-Euclidean geometry, a new geometry. On what shall we base the choice of theorems which will govern us in the new geometry? You have to get back to some fundamental principles. And we can learn something about that from the history of Europe, the history of particularly of the Renaissance. What was it that gave Europe the great power which it so much abused? At the beginning of the end of 14th century, Europe wasn't much. There were other parts of the world, India, China, and so forth, which had equal or higher levels of general development, of technology, government, arts of government, and so forth. But a new form of state, society, was created in the middle of the 15th century, centered around what was called the Golden Renaissance, the beginning of the modern nation state, which was committed to the education of every person, by principle, on the basis of the principle of man being in the image of God, the individual person. Therefore, every person must be educated in the way needed to realize their potential as a person made in the image of God. The person so educated must live in a society in which they are given the opportunity to express that developed talent in a way which makes their having lived useful when they have completed their run. To fulfill the promise which might have been expected of them by their ancestors, and to fulfill their responsibilities which should be expected of them by their posterity. To live a meaningful life in the run you have. And on this basis, there was created the modern sovereign nation state, a new geometry in relations. And thus the potential population of this planet rose after the 15th century in Europe from the several hundred million at which it had stagnated at maximum over the previous 1,500 years or so, world population, till we reach today a world population of in excess of 5 billion people. What made that possible? It was the idea of a nation state committed to universalizing education, committed to scientific and technological progress, improvements through discovery, and opportunities for the realization of self-development of individuals in society. The right to participate in self-government, the right to participate in the economy, the right to participate in the discovery of knowledge. It was this thing, this which made possible all those improvements which any part of the world has gained from out of European civilization in the past 5 centuries. We didn't complete the job. We didn't get rid of our parasites, and they now have taken us over. It's like you don't clean the worms out of your intestines, you may suffer. Right? We didn't deworm ourselves of the old financial oligarchy and so forth. We're suffering. But what was the foundation of the good that was in that revolution? The good that European civilization gave to the world. The good was what? That on the influence of Christianity, we recognized the need to create a form of society which is based on the principle that every person is made in the image of God. And that the test of this quality is the ability of man to, as Genesis prescribes, to increase mankind's dominion over the universe, increasingly by this process. This is what Africa has been denied. This is what we have denied ourselves in the course of the past 30 years, that principle. And this is what Africa requires. The right to have every African life, individual life, treated as the life of a person made in the image of God. The right to the forms of society which are consistent with that noble quality. The right to that kind of development. Now, if we try to fix Africa, just go in and fix it or do something right, it isn't going to work. Because the axioms that are now ruling the world say that man is not made in the image of God. Say that there's an excess of population in Africa, which is a big lie. Well, if you want to start with excess population, you go to London, for example. You want to take per square kilometer of land area, or take Belgium or some other country. You compare the population density of Africa with all its riches in sub-Saharan Africa with what is true in these countries. No, Africa is not overpopulated. It's underpopulated by education and opportunity, and it's overpopulated by Kabilas and other followers of George Bush's and people like that. No, but their principle does not exist in making a decision and making a policy. What belief guides you to make that decision? What rule must guide the bureaucrat? What rule must guide the government, must govern international relations to decide what it is are we going to do? And that will determine what happens. We must establish the axiomatic rule, not a do's and don'ts list, but the axiomatic rule, that no policy must be made which is not consistent with the fact that every human being is made in the image of God, and that their life is sacred on that account. Not only that their biological life, but their right to development and their right to participate in society on the basis of that principle. That relations among states, relations within states, laws passed by governments must submit themselves to those principles. The only hope we have is to look at this horror and turn this horror of Africa, horrors which are similarly represented in other places, and turn that into a lesson quickly and say, this is what we are seeing. We are seeing a great civilization which is destroying itself because it has denied the right of human beings in Africa and elsewhere, the right to be treated as persons created in the image of God. Has denied them the right to participate in their society, the right to honor their ancestors for what the ancestors gave them, the right to give their posterity what their posterity has a right to expect of them. And we must restore law, that principle of law. We must use the crisis, which discredits this enemy of ours within, this great financial crisis, this collapsing system, to improve upon what people like Clinton and others are discussing today in terms of proposals, pilot projects for a better future. We must intervene in that, introduce a new dimension of passion into that, and say we need a new civilization. We need the right turn in the road as we go from the broken past to the hopeful future. We must not repeat what Newt Gingrich and similar devils wishes to do. We must take the best lessons of our past, the best experience, the best achievements, and use that to advise us as building materials in creating a new order. With that determination, and letting Africa and the horror of Africa be a commitment, saying we are going to fix this. We recognize this cannot be fixed unless we're willing to change ourselves and our institutions. But we are going to fix it, and we will not quit until it's fixed. And let that be soon. Let us discredit those who do these crimes. all for the sake of teaching the lesson. What is the quality of mind that's fit to lead a nation? What is the quality of government which is fit for nations? What is the quality of law which must be efficient to protect the nation, the peoples, and the individuals? So I would hope that the lesson of what we're doing with Never Again is not simply seen as a humanitarian fix-it project. Yes, we must fix it. We must save every life we can save as quickly as possible. But I think we shall not win unless we understand our situation. This is not something that just happened. It happened because a great civilization is in great advanced moral decay. It's on its last legs. A financial system which is looting Africans, which is on its last legs. A financial oligarchy which is killing Africans, which is doomed to be crushed. Let us learn the lesson. And as this civilization dies, let us give birth to a new one, and quickly. Thank you.